for the New River Valley Master Naturalists. Got a great speaker lined up. We're going to have our speaker first and then our chapter news and announcements after our speaker. And Barb, if you would like to go ahead and introduce our speaker.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Hello, Dr. Metzgar. So glad to see your face. He is a curator of the Virginia Tech Massey Herbarium. He received his BS in biology from Cornell University and earned his PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. His current job involves researching the ecology and distribution of various ferns and other southeastern USA plants. He also runs an active outreach program in the local community to share his botanical knowledge and enthusiasm for natural history. Jordan became entranced by ferns when he was an undergraduate and then pursued a career in botany to further his passion. His favorite plant is walking fern. He lives in Christiansburg with his wife and 2 young sons. Take it away, Jordan.
Well, thank you, Barb. Does everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I'll try to share my screen here, so let me know if that's working or not. And then also I'll try to keep an eye on comments and things as they come in, but it's hard to do on my laptop. So if you notice something in the comment box, or if you have a question, feel free just to chime in and ask away. Okay. We good?
That's good.
See the screens? Okay, great. All right, so I'll talk to you tonight about our fern flora, and I think we talked about my background there pretty well in the intro. So I've been interested in ferns for just over 20 years now, which sounds kind of crazy to say, but it was all the way back in 2001. That's actually a picture of the day I became interested in ferns. I was out hiking with some friends and went through a glade of ostrich fern and was captivated by all the different species we saw that day, and pretty soon I was fully obsessed. My PhD work was on a very northern genus of ferns, the parsley ferns. This is a photo of one overlooking a fjord in Norway. They like very cold places, so unfortunately we don't have them around here, but I have worked on some of the other groups of ferns that we have here. Can somebody remind me how long I'm supposed to talk for? Is it?
Oh, like 30 to 40 minutes would be perfect. But
30 to 40 minutes. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. So I'll try to meet that. We'll probably skip some things along the way. If there's any topics that you all like and want to hear more about, be happy to come back and do something more devoted to that. For example, I've cut most of the cultural connections of ferns out of the talk to try to make time. And we'll go through these first few slides pretty quickly here. But as a reminder, when we think about ferns, they're plants. Specifically, they're vascular plants. So they're not mosses, they're not liverworts. They have some kind of system for moving food and water around their body, like xylem and phloem. They don't have seeds. So if you think of a grass or an orchid or a maple tree, anything that makes seeds like that, it's not a fern. So ferns use spores. They don't make flowers, they make sporangia, and they make little tiny dust-like spores that go out into the wild. And the study of ferns is called pteridology. It's from the Greek word for feather, pteridos, because of the feather-like appearance of the kind of conventional fern frond. There's a few things that aren't ferns. So asparagus fern, you might have one of these in your house. It's not a fern, it makes flowers. Sweet fern, it's kind of a nice plant, grows close to another fern called bracken that kind of looks like it, but not a fern. It's a flowering plant. Flowering fern, you can kind of see where this is going. If you have these in your garden, it's not a fern, makes big showy flowers. So there's a lot of things that get the common name of fern because they have real lacy leaves. It's kind of like a carrot. So there's some kind of crossover there where different groups of plants that aren't related have stumbled upon the same solution for leaf shape. So we get these things that look like ferns but aren't. So this slide shows a phylogeny, a tree of life, and you don't need to worry about that. We're not going to get too into that. What's important to know is that ferns are up here, and they're very closely related to the seed plants. They're actually different from what we call the club mosses, or if you have a fern field guide, probably calls them the fern allies. Most of the fern allies are actually in their own lineage. So we put them in their own group called the lycophytes now. So we'll talk about those a little bit tonight, and we'll talk about this group, the ferns, and we'll ignore the seed plants. But these lycophytes, the technical term for their taxonomy is Lycopodiopsida, and they're the fern allies. So this might look kind of complicated at first glance on the slide, but basically there's two big ways you can tell them apart. The first is that lycophytes have very simple leaves. They have what's called a microphyll. So they have a leaf that is often quite small, like the micro would suggest. Some of the tropical ones get bigger, but usually they have tiny leaves with a single vein running through them. And their sporangia, where they make their spores, is on what we call the adaxial side of the leaf, the upper side of the leaf. So if you're looking down at the forest floor and the sporangia are looking up at you, that's a good sign that it's a lycophyte, not a fern. We have a dozen or so species in the area. Some of the nice ones include things like shining club moss. A lot of these things get the common name moss because they look like mosses, but they do have a vascular system. Some of these get gathered as decorations, like for Christmas greenery or things. We have a few species of Selaginella, which are in the same group, but they're a little harder to spot. You have to be a little more eagle-eyed to spot those. But we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this group tonight, but they're out there. They're still pretty neat. We're going to look instead at the ferns tonight. So the Polypodiopsida is what we call the ferns. And the ferns, in contrast to those lycophytes, if you think of those same two characters, the ferns have a megaphyll. They have a leaf that's usually a lot bigger, but it has a lot more veins. It has a branched network of veins. The veins are splitting apart and covering more of that leaf area. And if you look at their sporangia, you have to flip the leaf over to do it because they're on the bottom side or the abaxial side of the leaf. So if you look down and the sporangia are looking up at you, it's a lycophyte. If you have to flip the leaf over, it's a fern. And then those leaf shapes are helpful too. More complicated leaf is more likely to be a fern. Less complicated is more likely to be a lycophyte. So within the ferns, we won't really talk about the the phylogenetics or the tree of life part again after this, really, to save time. But there are some different kind of taxonomic groups of ferns. There's a couple groups, the Eusporangiate ferns and the Leptosporangiate ferns. The sporangiate refers to their sporangium, the little structure that makes spores. And if you can't guess from the name, you can use the appearance or the shape of that sporangium to tell them apart. Eusporangia, it means good or nice sporangia in Latin. I don't really know where that came from. They're not really any better or anything. It's just a different strategy. But Eusporangia are bigger. They're a couple millimeters across. You can see them more easily with the naked eye. And they make hundreds, if not thousands, of spores. And when they break open to release the spores or dehiss, they just crack open like a clamshell. And worldwide, there's about 350 species. Around here, that would include things like our horsetails and scouring rushes. So that's the family Equisetum, the genus Equisetum. The cool thing about these plants, if you've never played around with one, is that they accumulate silica in their stems or in their tissues. So they, the body of these plants are very rough or coarse. So that's where the common name scouring rush comes from. You could use these if you were a settler, if you're out camping, basically like as nature's Brillo pad. The other common group of Eusporangiate ferns that we have around here are the family Ophioglossaceae. These usually are called the grape ferns or the moonworts. And there's a few different genera in this family, so they kind of look different. But one of our very common ferns that usually is emerging in the spring is rattlesnake fern, and it's in this group. You can see a close-up of this portion of the leaf that's making sporangia over here. And you can see these great big sporangia that have cracked open like clamshells. So that's Eusporangiate fern. The adder's tongues, these ones over here, are much less common. I know of one population in Montgomery County, so you don't run across them as often. But these plants have a division in the leaf. Part of the leaf is this big photosynthetic part. It's just making energy, making food for the plant. And then part of the leaf is just making spores. So you can see down here, there's a little junction, and part of the leaf that comes off is all green and lacy and looks like a normal leaf. That's the photosynthetic part. And part of the leaf that comes off is the reproductive part. So it sticks up here and it has all these sporangia on it. So it's just kind of a division of labor. Part of the leaf makes the spores, part of the leaf makes the food, but it's a nice character for this family. You can see on the adder's tongue, comes up out of the ground, splits into a photosynthetic part and into a reproductive part. This thing that looks like a rattlesnake's rattle is a whole bunch of sporangia that are fused together. So the Leptosporangiate ferns, they're way more common. There's over 8,000 of them on Earth. Most of them are tropical. They love rainforests and especially cloud forests. But even around here, they're more abundant in terms of species. And they get their name from their sporangium type, which is a Leptosporangium. So this is a picture taken under a microscope with a bunch of fluorescent dyes. So different parts of the sporangium have glowed different colors here. And we'll take a closer look at these. But from a kind of gestalt, it looks like a little Christmas bulb or Christmas ornament sitting on a little stalk or needle. So it has a little bit different shape compared to those like basketballs of the Eusporangiate ferns. They're also much smaller. They're about 200 microns wide. So if you squint, you can kind of see them on the underside of the leaf, but you really need magnification to be able to see anything at all. They make many fewer spores. And we'll take a look at this, but they have this really cool dehiscence method. Instead of just splitting open like a clamshell, they actually launch their spores like a catapult. So here's another view. This is from a scanning electron microscope. So these are fake colors again. These have been added in Photoshop or whatever. But we have this little stalk or needle, and then the bulb of the sporangium. And this bulb part is where the spores are produced. This one's already started to tear open a little bit. You can see these little greenish yellow-green spores coming out. The part of the structure that makes it act like a catapult is called the annulus. So that's shown in blue here. And you can see there's a thick wall, a thick wall, a thick wall, but this part here is much lighter. So this annulus is thickened on 3 sides, but not the 4th. So what happens is that when this dries out, when water starts to evaporate out of it, the weakest part of this plant becomes this unstrengthened side, or the weakest part of the sporangium becomes this unstrengthened side. So this annulus will go from this shape to curling backwards. And when it does that, it rips the entire sporangium open. That's where this tear came from. And then it reaches a point where there's so much pressure on the inside of these cells that air bubbles start to form, and the whole thing gets released, and it flicks forward and fires the spores into the air. So this is a little schematic. We're going to see a video in a second, but we start with a sporangium that's full of spores. When it dries out, water evaporates out of these annulus cells. The annulus stretches backward and rips the bulb open. And then when it gets released, it flings forward and goes back to kind of its old shape. It's just a little music soundtrack here. But so I'm going to pause it here for a second. This is one sporangium. This is one sporangium. This is one sporangium. So these kind of caramel colored worms here, those are the annulus. Each of those is an annulus. And then the kind of more tan or off-white colors, that's the walls of the sporangium, the sides of that bulb. So we're going to watch as they get dried out. This is in real time as well. So when they flick forward, that's not being sped up by the camera. Whoa, my apologies, just went to screensaver here. Okay, here we go. So as they dry out, it tears that bulb in half, and then it launches it forward. So this is purely mechanical. I can pull out a specimen from the collection here that's 20 years old. And if I put some lights from a microscope next to it, I can dry out those annuli, and I can make it do this under the microscope for me. So it doesn't need to be even alive to do this. So you can see there's spores all over the stage here. All these little tiny dust-like dots are the spores, and then the sporangia are here. Okay, I said I deleted all the cultural stuff, but I guess I lied. There's one cultural thing. Back before we figured out how ferns reproduced, people were convinced that they made seed because every other plant made seed. So they developed this whole mythology in Europe that ferns produced invisible seed, and that on St. John's Eve at midnight, the fern would release this seed, and that you could collect it by placing 12 pewter plates under the fern plant. The invisible seed would fall through the first 11 and then land on the bottom 12th plate, and you could collect this. And if you collected it, it would make you invisible as well. There's actually an exchange in one of Shakespeare's plays where a couple of thieves debate whether their thieving will be abetted by their stealthiness or by their having fern seed. But we know now that they make spores. And that's a good part to mention some terminology. There's a couple different terms that get confused a lot with ferns, and that's Sorus, sporangium, and spore. So right now they're arranged from biggest to smallest from left to right. So when you flip a fern leaf over and you see little circles or little horseshoes or little rectangles, depending on the genus, it can be a different shape. But when you see those things with the naked eye, each of those is a sorus. And that's a cluster of sporangia. So each of these yellowish brown dots here is a sorus. If we zoom in on a single sorus, we see that there's dozens, if not hundreds, of little sporangia in it. So the sporangia are much smaller than that. It's really hard to see them with the naked eye. And then we have to zoom in a lot more to be able to see the spores. Each of these sporangia is filled with usually either 64 or 128 spores. So a lot of times people will talk to me and say, you know, I flipped it over and I saw the spores on the back. What they saw were the sori, the sorus. And then you really need magnification for these other two. But this sorus is an important shape for identification. You want to make observations about its shape and its position on the leaf to help you ID ferns. The other trait of the sorus that you want to be paying attention to is whether or not it's protected. So a sorus can be exindusiate, it can have no covering, or it can be indusiate, it can have a covering over it. And we separate those into two categories. The false indusium, is what we call it when the edge of the leaf grows out and curls over like a tidal wave and protects the sporangia inside of it. And then the true indusium is what we call it when there's a projection and outgrowth from the bottom of the leaf, and it sticks up kind of like a little beach umbrella and protects the fern and protects the spores. So false and true, it's another one of those things where it sounds like one's better, but it really doesn't. I don't know where the history of the name comes from, but false indusium is the edge of the leaf curling over, and true indusium is that patio umbrella. And exindusiate is no covering at all. We have some little rock ferns around here called polypody, and they're our local example of exindusiate ferns. So this is just some examples of some of the shapes. The indusium can be round. It can be on the edge of the leaf, a false indusium. It can be kind of kidney shaped. It can be cup shaped, like more three-dimensional. So there's a lot of different possibilities for that character, but you want to pay attention to whether or not it has an indusium and what shape the sorus is in. And that'll help you narrow down your choices a lot. Ferns also, or Leptosporangiate ferns also have what's called a fiddlehead. The technical term is circinnate vernation. And this is where the new leaf unfurls in a spiral. It looks like the head of a violin, or the other name is crosier for the resemblance to a bishop's staff. Sundews and cycads will do that as well, but sundews are covered in little gelatinous red hairs and are very tiny. And cycads you only find in here in a greenhouse. So in our area, if you find a fiddlehead, you can be pretty confident you've found a Leptosporangiate fern. This is a time lapse. This covers a couple weeks, but this shows some emerging leaves, and we'll show how they unfurl here. You can see this one over here is almost completely unfurled. So the whole thing just unwraps from that spiral. So that's a fiddlehead. I think I have a slide later about edible ferns, so we can talk about that when we get there. There's a lot of terminology for fern identification, which is kind of unfortunate, but when you look at a identification key, you'll probably see a lot of different terms that you might not be used to. When we talk about a single fern leaf, we usually call it a frond, and we divide it into a couple parts. The little leaf stalk we call the stipe, and then we call the rest of it the blade. If there's little bits of leaf stalk that are exposed in the blade, we call it a rachis. So the rachis is the leaf stalk once the green tissue starts. The stipe is the leaf stalk below the green tissue. And then the first big division of a fern leaf, we call a pinna. And then if we divide it again, if we split that up into a little section, we call it a pinnule. The shape of the leaf can be very important. Often they'll either be diamond shaped, fattest in the middle, or they'll be triangle shaped, fattest at the bottom, or they'll be this kind of trapezoid shape where they're fattest in the middle, but they don't taper down to nothingness at the bottom. They only get a little bit smaller towards the base of the leaf. So as an example, that last one, cinnamon fern, one of our nice wetland species, it has leaves that are thickest in the middle, and then they taper down to smaller leaflets, but still distinguishable size here near the bottom. So it's got more of that trapezoid shape. Whereas ostrich fern, Metutia struthiopteris, it's fattest in the middle, but its leaflets taper down to basically nothing. You can see they just keep getting smaller and smaller until they just cease to exist down here. So that's more of our diamond shaped. There's many possible traits for that. So it's kind of just something to be aware of, to be observant of when you're starting to practice fern ID. And as you practice it and start to learn different species, you learn these different terms. We won't really go back to this phylogeny again in the interest of time, but there's a lot of diversity within the Leptosporangiate ferns. There's a lot of different orders and families. So sometimes these distinctions that we're talking about are between different species might have hundreds of millions of years behind them. On that note, I'll mention the oldest living fern family, the Osmundaceae. We just looked at a cinnamon fern for its leaf shape. Here's a cinnamon fern growing in a garden. Things in this family often have dimorphic leaves where the fertile leaves and the sterile leaves look different. So these are completely different leaves, unlike those Eusporangiate ferns we were looking at earlier. But they have one leaf that just reproduces and one leaf that just photosynthesizes. And they make green spores. Their spores are actually released and are basically photosynthesizing away and have a very short lifespan. They need to find somewhere to land and grow or they die. They run out of food. Most ferns have spores that can be stable for years, and those are usually tan or brown. But the royal fern family is the oldest fern family. It is known from the fossil record back to the Permian, which is almost 300 million years ago. They've found fossils that look remarkably like living species. This fossil here was found in the Permian, and the authors argued that it was very closely related to our present day interrupted fern. So this family has a very long fossil history and is very ancient. So that brings me to one other thing about how people talk about ferns, and they'll often talk about how ferns are ancient, dinosaurs of the plant world kind of deal. And are they? It kind of depends on your perspective. So if we look at geologic time, the very oldest ferns, which are extinct now, go back to the Devonian, which is almost 400 million years ago. So that's pretty old. That's definitely ancient. That's older than dinosaurs. But those lineages are now extinct. The royal fern family from the Permian is still hanging on, but most of what we have is much more recent. So most ferns evolved since we developed modern rainforests on Earth after the age of the dinosaurs. So most fern genera, most fern families are younger than this about 65 million year mark. So when you start to look at individual species, they're not really any older than like the average flowering plant species. So ferns as a whole, you could think of as ancient or as a kind of a dinosaur, but for present day species, they're really not any older than flowering plant or gymnosperm species. So kind of yes, kind of no to whether they're ancient dinosaurs. Some ferns can be invasive. This is Lygodium japonicum, the Japanese climbing fern, which is a huge problem in Florida and is making its way northward. We actually just reported the first documented occurrence of this from out in Virginia's coastal plain. So first occurrence in the state. So it's probably not gonna reach us for a while, if ever, but this is something that could become more of a problem out in our coastal areas. But this is a vining species. And you can see here, it's just completely covered basically an entire forest and chokes out native vegetation. So most of our ferns in the area are native, but there are such a thing as invasive ferns. We're gonna, well, yeah, we'll skip this actually. We'll talk about this part of it here. So hay-scented fern is fairly common around here. It really likes the edges of woods, and deer do not like to eat it. So especially in forests that have a deer problem, you'll find more of this. But it's a great example of a long creeping rhizome. You can see this is basically a carpet of hay-scented fern. And if you look at it, the leaves are just coming up everywhere. And these are the stems that are growing underground. So this stem just grows out and sends up new leaves, and it just becomes this thick mat. So that's a long creeping rhizome. It's a nice character for hay-scented fern and some other species in our area. The other option is that it can be an erect or crown forming rhizome. So for that, I always like to think of it as it looks like it's ready to be plopped into a vase. It's just this little little clump of leaves. So here, it's not spreading everywhere. It's not a big carpet. It's just a discrete little bunch of leaves. We're going to skip a few of these in the interest of time. I did mention I would talk about culinary ferns. So ostrich fern, Matutia struthiopteris. This is a very rare fern in Virginia. There's 3 or 4 known wild localities. It's called ostrich fern. It also gets the common name fiddlehead fern. And this is our edible species. So these fiddleheads, this picture here, they're just perfect size to be snapped off and eaten. Usually you cook them kind of like asparagus. But we get a little bit of common name confusion. People will call it fiddlehead fern. So then when you talk about other species of fern having a fiddlehead, they get confused. So remember, just about all the Leptosporangiate ferns have a fiddlehead, but it's just this one, the ostrich fern, that we eat. In other parts of the world, some other species are eaten. For example, there's a diplasium that's eaten in Malaysia. Bracken fern is eaten in a lot of East Asia. It's also thought to correlate with stomach cancer rates in those areas. So I would advise not eating it, even though you can find wild bracken fern around here. We're going to skip to a couple community slides. So this is not an exhaustive list of habitats, but we're going to go through a couple spots where you'll see ferns or where it might be particularly good for seeing ferns. So around here, more or less everywhere there's woods, you can find these 3 species. So Christmas fern on the left here is probably our most common fern. It's Polystichum acrosticoides. I don't know if you can see it, but the bottoms of the leaves are, those stipes are very scaly. There's all kinds of brown fuzz on them. And these usually get kind of bigger. They're 12 inches, 18 inches tall. They're a few inches wide. And they get the name Christmas fern because they're still green right now. They're wintergreen. And these little leaflets, if you pull one off, they have a little notch here at the bottom, so they look like a little stocking, like Christmas stockings. but these are basically everywhere. So if you want to learn a species of fern, this is a great one to learn because 3/4 of the time, that's what you'll be looking at. Ebony spleenwort is kind of a smaller, more delicate version of that. It's very common, especially in more limey woods. Get that limestone influence. They're usually much smaller. They're a lot skinnier than Christmas fern, and they're usually much shorter. And then we have one very common Eusporangiate fern. The rattlesnake fern is very common around here. It's really easy to spot kind of in the middle or end of our spring ephemeral season. These will start emerging, and you'll see these leaves that have that sterile photosynthetic portion and that fertile reproductive part making spores. So if you want to go by abundance, if you learn those three, you'll know most of the ferns in Montgomery County by biomass or by abundance. The best place, in my opinion, to look for ferns around here is in forests or outcrops with a strong limestone influence. So if you're in limestone woods or cliffs that are on the dry side, you can see more than this, but three of the more distinctive or more characteristic species maybe are this purple cliffbrake. This is Pelea atropurpurea. This has those false indusia. The edge of the leaf curls over to protect the sporangia. This also shows up on a lot of campus buildings. It likes hokie stone too. You get what's called the wall rue. The species also grows in England, where it likes to grow on old stone walls. So it gets the common name wall rue. Very delicate, kind of fan-shaped leaflets. And the black stem spleenwort, which looks a lot like ebony spleenwort, but it has an entirely black stipe and rachis. So entirely black leaf stalk. When you get into wetter areas, you start to pick up a few different species. One of my favorite is bulblet fern. This fern likes shady, wet, lush ravines or gorges, especially. You get into those areas where it's really humid and very shady and lots of limestone, and you'll start to find this species. Has long, slender leaves, but the great character, which no other fern in our area has, are the bulblets. So this is the bulblet fern, and on the underside, usually by early to midsummer, you can pick these out pretty easily. It makes these little bulblets. These are vegetative propagules, like how a mother of thousands makes little plantlets on the edge of its leaf. Same idea here. These will fall off and form a new plant quicker than a spore can. So the bulblet fern. My favorite fern, the walking fern. It's one of our few species that has entire leaves. The leaves are not dissected at all. They're just one entire piece of leaf tissue. And it's called walking fern because it grows on these limestone cliffs, and it has these very long, skinny leaf tips. And I don't know if this will show up on your screen or not, but you can see one twist around here, and then there's a little baby plant forming. So that leaf tip grows out along the rock, it hits the rock somewhere, and it forms a new plant. So it walks along the cliff over time. One of our prettiest ferns is the maidenhair spleenwort. This is a smaller fern that grows in tight bunches or clumps like this. Because nature's never easy, there's actually two different varieties or subspecies of this fern. One's a diploid, has 2 copies of each chromosome, and it actually prefers acid rocks. But the photo here is of the tetraploid one, the tetraploid subspecies that has 4 copies of each chromosome and likes limestone rocks. They're pretty much impossible to tell apart otherwise unless you literally measure the spores, which one of my students has been doing for a couple of years and is mapping the distribution of each subspecies across the Southeast. So it is 7:43, so I think I've pretty much hit my time. So I'll just mention in closing that if you're interested in further reading or further directions, Natural History of Ferns is a great book. It is not a textbook. It's written by a colleague and friend of mine, Robin Moran. And he has a lot of great stories about ferns and describes a lot of fern biology in very accessible terms. And the American Fern Society also has a newsletter and has a spore exchange where you can try growing different species of fern from spore. In the Herbarium, which is our plant museum here, we also welcome volunteers. This is Linda, one of the master naturalists from the area, and she's volunteered a lot for us over the years. Here she's preparing specimens. We also get volunteer help with our outreach events. It's a lot of fun. We had a volunteer here this afternoon who, when she left, said, I feel like I should pay you for this therapy experience because she found preparing the plants so soothing and enjoyable. So if you're interested in doing that and fulfilling your service requirements, feel free to contact me. We're always happy to have volunteers. Then we have a website and Facebook page and things too. Whoops. And I haven't had the camera on, so hopefully you're all still awake. Do I have any time for questions, or have I run over?
Yeah, we've got plenty of time. So anybody has questions, we've got time for them.
I have a question about the maidenhair fern. So they're I'm looking back at my notes. The maidenhair spleenwort, that one's different than the one that's taller. Maidenhair, am I right about that?
Yeah, so it gets confusing. There's the maidenhair fern, which is in an entirely different family and genus, and there's the maidenhair spleenwort.
Okay.
So maidenhair spleenwort, the one I showed you, it's in the genus Asplenium, and it's small. It grows on rock, and if you flip over its leaves and look at those sori, they'll be shaped like little lines or rectangles. The maidenhair spleenwort is taller. It usually gets foot tall, maybe a little more. It's a more northern species, so you don't run into it as often. You kind of need a more sheltered spot. And it tends to like some of the same habitats. Like you'll find it growing on the forest floor right below an outcrop of maidenhair spleenworts. You can find them right next to each other. But it has leaves that the stalk comes up and it splits into two like a halo. And then if you flip them over, it'll have that false indusium. The edge of the leaf will curl over to protect the sporangia. So they're bigger, they're usually on soil, and they have that false indusium. My student was asking why the names were so similar the other day, and we looked it up, and the maidenhair spleenwort got its common name because it looks like the maidenhair fern. So maybe not a great choice for names, but they're unrelated, and you can tell them apart fairly easily.
Okay. Well, I ask because I do see that taller one in different places in Montgomery County, not all over, but you see it. But I have another one in my garden that I have no idea how I got it. I'm sure someone gave it to me. That's like a ground cover, only it looks like a maidenhair, but it's not the spleenwort. So it must be one that's from somewhere else, I guess.
It could be, yeah. They can move by spore, which, I mean, obviously you'd never see that because they're microscopic, and then some of them can move by rhizome fairly well. Okay. So if there was a little bit of stem in your potting mix, it could have introduced it that way.
Well, maybe that's what happened, because I really don't recall it, but I've been tending it a long time and I have a good sized patch of it. So cool. I guess I'll pay attention to it now, see what it is.
Yeah, maybe you can check out the sori.
Yes, yes, I could.
I see Beth asked, where are the spores successful? And you can cultivate them pretty easily at home. I have a couple trays in my office where I sterilize some soil and I just sprinkle them on the dirt, and I actually grow them in a takeout salad container from Kroger, one of those plastic clamshells. You can grow them on terracotta pot fragments. But in the wild, it's the craziest thing. They're really hard to find unless it's freshly exposed soil. So a bulldozer goes through and tears out a road or something, and for the next year or so, you might be able to find gametophytes on the side of it. But then once it gets a little older, you won't see gametophytes anymore. So it's kind of the craziest thing for finding them in the wild. But it
I was
also,
reading that marginal fern uses where trees tilt over, you know, where they tilt over, that soil is where they.
yep, yeah. So when the tree tips over, that'll expose some dirt, and they can get a start there. And then it depends a bit on the species too. Like if it's a rock fern, its spores will probably do better on a cliff than in a swamp or whatever. But and Lucinda asked if there'll be access to the slides. I'm happy to send um, the slides along to Barb or whoever facilitates that. There's a couple sections after that I didn't have time for. Like there's a little thing about why taxonomic names change with a example with our local species and some stuff like that. So there's a little bit of extra material in there too.
Well, whatever you sent me earlier, I probably still have. Is that shareable by you?
Probably. I can check.
I'll check with you before I do anything. But I mean, I watched it and learned so much. It's amazing what there is to know, actually, about ferns.
You can make a whole career out of them.
I guess you can.
I know of 2 different gardens that have ostrich fern in them, and one of them is my neighbor's, and it's almost unstoppable. I mean, it spreads all over the place. So why is it, I don't, is this a different kind of ostrich fern than you were talking about? It seems like if that grew in the wild, it would be everywhere.
We're right at the southern end of the ostrich ferns range. And it really likes rich floodplain forests. So there's a spot about 45 minutes away. I think that's the closest to the populations where it's just in this floodplain forest, really rich soil. So it does really well there. And then it definitely does do well in gardens around here if you can keep it wet enough and have rich soil. But why it doesn't spread more in the wild, I really don't know. There must be some kind of climate restriction on it. It could be that it's one part of the life cycle might not be able to survive certain temperatures, or I'm not sure offhand, but yeah, it does well in gardens.
Yeah, these that migrate into my yard, they don't seem to care what the soil is. They just,
Yeah,
they don't even care if I mow them down. I mean, they just keep coming back. I feel like they would take over my entire yard if I didn't.
You just
sounds
need
like
to
a
eat
good
them.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. It's like now I have a new option.
Yeah.
Do they need to be eaten when they're fiddleheads?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're not very good if you wait too long. So when they're maybe 2-3 inches tall, you snap them off and brush them off and rinse them off. And usually any way you cook asparagus, you can cook them.
I wonder why deer don't like them then.
Yeah.
They've gone rogue in my garden too. I dig them out like crazy and throw them out because they want to be an only child. That's all there is to it, in a nice rich garden soil.
Are there any other questions? Does anyone else have a question for Jordan?
I also have another question. So to me, there are a lot of ferns that you didn't talk about. You didn't talk about these kinds that look almost exactly identical. And when I use my guidebook, it's really, really hard to tell them apart. Does your slideshow that you didn't show give any information about how to distinguish those ferns that look so much alike?
It doesn't go through every species, no. What I'd recommend is starting big and learn how to recognize one genus from another, that sort of thing,
Uh-huh.
and then with time fill it in. But some of them are hard. Like I was talking about this earlier today, and it's basically like trying to identify flowering plants when they're out of season. So if you think of when you're out identifying wildflowers, you look at the flowers, you look at the fruits, and when you go look at a fern, you don't have any of those. You have the shape of the Sorus, but that's about it. So you're doing like winter tree ID or sterile plant ID. So it is honestly harder. What I find works for me is trying to find one or two good characters. Like there's a couple species of Dryopteris, of wood fern in our area that look really, really similar. But if you look at the very bottom leaflet and then go over to the second pinule growing down, on the one species, that pinule is longer than the one next to it. On the other one, it's shorter.
Oh,
So
wow.
I try to find things like that, and then find and then comparing it to known material, like find a good picture with a confident identification on iNaturalist, or drop by the herbarium and look at a specimen or something like that, where you know for a fact that you can use it as a reference, and compare that to try to figure out the characters for that species a little better.
Well, and I've also like come across a population of a fern, and I can't find a leaf that doesn't have the sporangia on it, that does have the sporangia on it, even though I know it's not one of those ones that has the dimorphic thing. It's just, I mean, what's
some
in
of them
some
are
ferns,
very,
is there a fairly high percentage of leaves that aren't fertile, even though?
yeah.
Okay.
Some of the ones, especially the ones that spread vegetatively really well, like Bracken fern, it can be hard to find fertile leaves.
Okay.
Oak ferns, the genus Gymnocarpium, they spread the same way that hay scented does. And a lot of times you might have to hunt through the whole population to find a fertile leaf. So if they're ones that do really well with clonal growth like that, you might not find fertile leaves. And then if it's a young population, or if it's kind of marginal habitat, they might not be able to make fertile leaves. But
Okay, that's helpful. I mean, it's not helpful in identification, but it's helpful to know what I'm dealing with.
You're not failing. Yeah, it's just hard.
We have a comment about good sources for buying ferns. What's some good advice about buying ferns?
The Plant Delights Nursery in North Carolina has quite a large variety, mix of both native species and garden species. But otherwise, I usually just kind of check same plant nurseries I do for other places.
Okay.
I'm not a great gardener though, so.
Okay, well, I want to thank you
I
so
want to
much.
ask one more question. What were those two
Okay.
Dryopteris you were talking about? Are there two types of marginal ferns?
No, it's so marginal is Dryopteris marginalis. So I was talking about a couple different species. There's like, I don't know, 24 Dryopteris in Virginia. But Dryopteris intermedia is one of them. And then what's the other one called now? Carthusiana, Dryopteris carthusiana.
Okay.
I can put those in the chat for you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. We really,
Yep.
I feel like I learned a lot, and love to have you back anytime. So
Yay.
thank you.